May 19th, 1536. Dawn. A woman in a gray damask gown walks across Tower Green. Her hair is pinned beneath a simple headdress. Her hands are steady. Her name is Anne Boleyn. 3 years ago, she was crowned Queen of England in this very fortress, walking these same stones in triumph while crowds cheered and cannons fired salutes across the Thames. Today, she will die here. The scaffold stands in the center of the green, built low to the ground, perhaps 3 feet high. Fresh straw has been scattered across the wooden platform to absorb what is about to happen. A French swordsman waits beside it, his blade hidden beneath the straw. He has been brought from Calais specifically for this task, at Anne's own request. The traditional English axe was considered too crude, too likely to require multiple strokes. Anne had begged for a sword. It was the one mercy Henry granted her. The crowd is small, perhaps 1,000 people, gathered in near silence. No common citizens were permitted, only nobles, officials, and those whose presence was required by protocol. The Lord Mayor of London, the sheriffs, foreign ambassadors who would carry word of this execution back to their masters across Europe. Anne climbs the steps. She does not stumble. She does not weep. According to witnesses, she speaks briefly. She prays for the king. She asks the crowd to pray for her soul. She forgives those who have condemned her to death. Some accounts say she even managed a joke about her little neck. Then she kneels. The swordsman has positioned himself to her left. Anne does not see him move. She is still praying when the blade falls. One stroke. Clean, final. Her lips, some witnesses claimed, continued moving for several seconds after. Within hours, Henry VIII is engaged to Jane Seymour. Within 11 days, they are married. Within 18 months, Jane is dead in childbirth, having given Henry the son he so desperately wanted, the son for whom Anne Boleyn lost her head. This is the Tower of London. For nearly 1,000 years, it has stood on the banks of the River Thames, a royal palace, a prison, an execution ground, a treasury, a zoo, a torture chamber, an armory, a mint where England's coins were struck, a records office where the nation's documents were stored, a place where kings have been crowned and queens have lost their heads. More than any castle in Europe, the tower has served as the stage for English history's bloodiest dramas. The princes who vanished from their beds and were never seen again. The traitors who confessed under torture, their bodies broken on the rack. The pretenders who died for their claims to the throne. The wives who paid the ultimate price for failing to produce an heir. The walls have witnessed coronation processions and funeral marches, royal weddings and political executions, births and murders, and everything in between. Today, 3 million visitors pass through its gates each year. They photograph the ravens that strut across the lawns. They marvel at the crown jewels glittering behind bulletproof glass. They stand on Tower Green, on the very spot where Anne Boleyn knelt, and try to imagine what she saw in those final moments. The gray English sky, the faces of the crowd, the swordsman waiting just beyond her vision. But beneath the tourist attractions and the ceremonial guards, another tower remains, one that most visitors never see. Hidden passages running through walls 15 feet thick, torture chambers where the rack still stands, its wooden frame worn smooth by struggling bodies, cells where men carved their names into stone walls, knowing they would never leave alive, secret staircases descending into darkness, dungeons so small that prisoners could neither stand, nor sit, nor lie down. The tower keeps its secrets close, but the stones remember. How did a fortress built to protect a conquering king become England's most infamous prison? What happened inside these walls that still haunts them nearly a millennium later? And what secrets does the tower still keep? buried beneath centuries of history. To understand, we need to go back to the beginning, to a time before the tower existed, to an invasion that would change England forever. October 14th, 1066. On a hillside near Hastings, two armies faced each other across a shallow valley. On one side, the Anglo-Saxon forces of King Harold Godwinson, the last of the English kings. On the other, the Norman invaders led by William, Duke of Normandy. Harold's army was exhausted. Just weeks before, they had marched 200 miles north to defeat a Norwegian invasion at Stamford Bridge. Now they had marched south again, with barely time to rest, to face this new threat from across the Channel. The battle lasted all day. Wave after wave of Norman cavalry crashed against the Saxon shield wall. Arrows darkened the sky. Men screamed and died in the mud. The Saxons held their ground on the ridge, their shields locked together, their axes rising and falling. Then, late in the afternoon, the Norman cavalry feigned retreat. The Saxon fyrd, the common soldiers, broke ranks to pursue. It was a fatal mistake. The Norman horsemen wheeled and cut them down. The shield wall fragmented, and Harold fell. Legend says he took an arrow to the eye, piercing through his helmet and into his brain. The Bayeux Tapestry shows this scene, though historians still debate what it actually depicts. What is certain is that by nightfall, Harold was dead, his army was scattered, and the crown of England lay unclaimed on a blood-soaked hillside. William had won his battle, but he had not yet won his kingdom. The road to London was not open. The city's walls were ancient Roman stone, repaired and reinforced over centuries, still formidable after 800 years. Its citizens were hostile to this foreign duke who spoke a different language, followed different customs, worshipped God in a different style. The English nobility rallied behind Edgar Atheling, a boy of 14 who had a legitimate claim to the throne through his great-grandfather Edmund Ironside. William understood that taking London by force could destroy the very prize he sought. He needed the city's wealth, its trade routes, its tax revenues, its administrative machinery. He could not simply burn it down, so he did something more cunning. He surrounded it. Norman forces swept through the countryside south of the Thames, then crossed the river at Wallingford and circled north and west. They burned farms and villages, they slaughtered livestock, they cut off supplies, they demonstrated with calculated brutality what resistance would cost. The message was clear: submit or starve, submit or watch your homes burn, submit or face the same fate as Harold's army. It took weeks, but eventually, London's leaders came to him at Berkhamsted. They brought the young Edgar Atheling with them. They opened the gates, they bent the knee, they surrendered. William entered the city on Christmas Day, 1066. He was crowned at Westminster Abbey, the same church where English kings had been crowned for generations, where Edward the Confessor himself had been laid to rest just months before. But even as the crown touched his head, even as the congregation shouted their acclaim, something went wrong. The Norman guards outside, hearing the shouting and not understanding the words, thought a riot had broken out. They set fire to the surrounding houses. Panic spread. The coronation continued inside the abbey, with flames visible through the windows and smoke filling the nave. It was an ominous beginning, and William understood what it meant. The English hated him. Rebellions were already brewing. In the north, where the old Saxon nobility still held power and Danish allies might yet arrive. In the west, where the Welsh border remained unstable and local lords refused to acknowledge Norman authority. In the fenlands of the east, where a man named Hereward would soon lead a famous resistance. Across the entire island, whispers of revolt spread from village to village. William had won a crown, but he had not won a country. He was a foreign conqueror ruling a hostile population of perhaps 2 million people with only a few thousand Norman soldiers to enforce his will. Every day brought new plots, new conspiracies, new threats. His position was precarious. His life was in constant danger. He needed castles, lots of them, everywhere. The Normans were master castle builders. In France, they had perfected a design called the Motte and Bailey, a wooden tower on a raised mound of earth, surrounded by a protective courtyard enclosed by a wooden palisade and ditch. These fortifications could be thrown up quickly, sometimes in just a few weeks, using local labor forced to work at sword point. A small garrison of perhaps 20 or 30 knights could hold them against much larger forces. They provided defensible positions for Norman soldiers in hostile territory. Within 5 years of the conquest, the Normans had built over 500 castles across England. The landscape was transformed. Every major town, every strategic crossroads, every river crossing bristled with Norman fortifications. The message was carved into the very earth. We are here. We are staying. Resistance is futile. But London required something special. The capital needed a castle that would not just defend against rebellion, it needed a castle that would terrify. A permanent statement of Norman power, visible to every citizen, every merchant, every would-be rebel who dared to dream of throwing off the yoke of conquest. William chose his site with the strategic eye of a military genius, the southeastern corner of the old Roman walls, where the Thames bent sharply to the south. The location was perfect in every way. The river provided natural defense on one side, its waters too deep and too swift for easy crossing. The existing Roman walls could be incorporated into the new fortification, saving months of labor. The site commanded views up and down the river, and ships entering London from the sea would see the castle first, looming above them, dominating the skyline before anything else came into view. Any merchant sailing up the Thames, any ambassador arriving by water, any potential enemy would understand immediately who ruled this city. The castle would be the first thing they saw and the last thing they forgot. Construction began in 1078. William brought over a Norman monk named Gundulf to supervise the work. Gundulf was already famous for his building skills, having overseen the construction of Rochester Cathedral and numerous other projects in Normandy. He understood stone in a way few men of his age did. He knew how to calculate loads and stresses. He knew how to lay foundations that would stand for centuries. He knew how to build for eternity. The design was revolutionary for England. Not a wooden tower like the hundreds of Motte and Bailey castles scattered across the kingdom, but a massive stone keep. The structure would eventually rise nearly 90 feet high, roughly the height of a modern 8-story building. The walls would be 15 feet thick at the base, tapering to 11 feet at the top. They were built to withstand battering rams, siege towers, undermining, and anything else an enemy might throw at them. The stone itself was a statement of power. Pale Caen limestone, imported from Normandy at enormous expense. Ships crossed the channel loaded with blocks of stone, a logistical undertaking of staggering complexity. Hundreds of voyages. Thousands of tons of material, all to ensure that even the building materials would remind Londoners that their new masters had come from across the sea. Local Kentish ragstone was used for the interior, but the facing was Norman through and through. The keep would become known as the White Tower, whitewashed in the 13th century, giving it the name that has stuck for 800 years. But even before that, the pale Norman stone stood in stark contrast to the darker Roman walls surrounding it. It was meant to stand out. It was meant to dominate. It was meant to be seen from miles away, a pale fist raised against the sky. William did not live to see it completed. He died in 1087, 9 years after construction began, thrown from his horse during a siege in France. The horse had stepped on hot embers, reared, and thrown the aging king against his saddle pommel, rupturing his intestines. He died in agony over several days. His body was so bloated by the time of burial that it burst during the funeral service. His son, William Rufus, finished the work on the tower. By 1100, the White Tower stood complete. It was the largest building in England. It was the tallest structure in London. It was visible from miles away, a pale finger pointing at the sky, and it had already begun to acquire its dark reputation. The first notable prisoner was Ranulph Flambard, Bishop of Durham, arrested in 1100 on charges of extortion and abuse of power. He was held in comfortable quarters befitting his ecclesiastical rank. He was allowed servants, visitors, fine food, and wine. One night, Flambard hosted a feast for his guards, plying them with drink until they collapsed unconscious. Then he produced a rope that had been smuggled inside a wine cask, lowered himself from a window, and escaped across the channel to Normandy. He was the tower's first escapee. He would not be the last. But for every prisoner who slipped away, hundreds more would enter these walls and never leave. Step inside the White Tower today, and you step into a world designed to overwhelm. The entrance is not at ground level. It never was. Visitors enter through a doorway on the first floor, roughly 15 feet above the ground, reached by an external wooden staircase that clings to the southern wall. This was deliberate defensive design, perfected over centuries of castle building in Normandy. In a siege, the wooden stairs could be destroyed or pulled up, making the tower nearly impossible to breach. The massive door, reinforced with iron, could be barred from within. The only way in would be through 15 feet of solid stone, or by climbing the sheer walls under a rain of arrows and boiling oil. Even entering as a friend required climbing, looking up at the massive walls, feeling small and vulnerable against the vast expanse of pale limestone. The psychological effect was intentional. The architecture announced power before you even stepped inside. The White Tower's interior is divided into 3 main floors, each split into 2 large rooms by a massive cross wall running north to south. This wall is an engineering marvel, nearly as thick as the exterior walls. It supports the entire structure, dividing the interior while providing the spine that holds everything together. Hidden within this central wall are the flues for the fireplaces that heated the building, channeling smoke up through the stone and out through vents in the roof. This was advanced technology for its time. Earlier castles had simply allowed smoke to drift up and out through holes in the ceiling, filling rooms with haze. The Norman design provided warmth without suffocation. The ground floor was never meant for habitation. This was storage, pure and simple. Food supplies for withstanding a siege, enough to feed the garrison for months. Weapons and armor for the soldiers, treasure and valuables that needed protection from thieves and fire. The ceilings are low here, perhaps 12 feet. The windows are narrow slits that let in barely enough light to see. Walk through it today, and you can still feel the weight of the stone above you. The walls sweat with moisture seeping from the Thames. The air is cool even in August. This is the building's basement, its gut, the utilitarian space that made everything above possible. In the tower's darker centuries, these ground floor chambers served another purpose. They became dungeons. Prisoners deemed unworthy of comfortable quarters were confined in this perpetual twilight, the damp seeping into their bones, the darkness eroding their hope. Climb the spiral staircase to the first floor, and the atmosphere changes dramatically. The stairs themselves are a defensive feature that most visitors miss. They spiral clockwise as you ascend, a design that favored right-handed defenders. An attacker climbing the stairs would have the central pillar blocking his sword arm, making it nearly impossible to swing effectively. A defender above would have full freedom of movement, his right arm on the open side, Every detail was calculated for survival. The first floor was the entrance level, where the castle's public business was conducted. The rooms are larger here, perhaps 40 feet across. The windows are wider, though still narrow enough to prevent entry. Light actually penetrates the massive walls, casting long shadows across the stone floors. This floor contained what was essentially the castle's administrative center, the great hall where the constable of the tower held court and dispensed justice, a chamber where prisoners were sometimes brought for questioning before witnesses, rooms where clerks kept records and officials conducted the daily business of maintaining a fortress. The ceilings are higher here, perhaps 20 feet, creating a sense of space and authority. The fireplaces are larger, capable of heating the vast chambers. The architectural message has shifted. This is still a fortress, still a statement of power, but it is also a functional building where real work happened, where decisions were made, where lives hung in the balance. But the real power sat above. The second floor was the royal floor. Here, the king himself could reside when he chose to stay at the tower, and medieval kings spent considerable time here. The tower was not just a prison or a fortress. It was a royal palace, one of the primary residences of the English crown. The rooms on this floor are grander than anything below. Fireplaces with carved stone surrounds provided warmth. Garderobes, medieval toilets built into the thickness of the walls, emptied through shafts to the exterior, providing a measure of privacy and sanitation that was remarkable for the age. The ceilings soar overhead. Windows with stone seats built into the deep embrasures offered views across the city and river. A king could sit in these window seats, looking out over his capital, watching the ships come and go on the Thames, seeing but unseen. The most remarkable room on this floor, the most remarkable room in the entire building, is the chapel of St. John the Evangelist. It sits in the southeastern corner of the White Tower, occupying a full 2 stories of the building's height. Step inside, and you step into the purest surviving example of Norman Romanesque architecture in England, perhaps in all of Europe. Round arches march in solemn procession around the apse. Thick columns, each carved from a single massive block of limestone, support a barrel-vaulted ceiling that curves overhead like the hull of an upturned ship. The stone is unadorned, almost austere. No painted murals, though there may once have been. No gilded decorations, just stone on stone, proportion and light, the medieval aesthetic of worship through architecture. The proportions are mathematically precise. The relationship between height and width, between column spacing and arch depth, follows rules laid down centuries earlier in ancient Rome and carried forward through Byzantine and Carolingian architecture. The Normans were building according to principles inherited from antiquity itself. The acoustics are extraordinary. A whispered prayer carries from one end to the other. A sung mass would have resonated through the stone, filling the space with sound. This chapel has witnessed nearly a millennium of English history. Knights kept vigil here through the night before their ceremonies of investiture, kneeling on the cold stone floor, praying and fasting until dawn, preparing their souls to receive the honor of knighthood. Henry VII's queen, Elizabeth of York, lay in state here after her death in childbirth. Mary, I was married by proxy in this chapel, the ceremony conducted while her bridegroom, Philip of Spain, was still abroad. The room has absorbed centuries of prayers, ceremonies, and silent contemplation. Generations of kings and queens have knelt where you can stand today. The stone floor has been worn smooth by countless feet, slight depressions marking where the faithful stood for Mass, decade after decade, century after century. Walk through the White Tower today, and you walk through a museum of arms and armor. The royal armories have been housed here since the 15th century, and the collections are dazzling. Suits of armor made for Henry VIII line the walls, each one larger than the last, documenting his expanding waistline as he aged. The athletic young king who jousted and hunted and danced until dawn became the bloated tyrant who could barely walk. His armor tells the story more eloquently than any portrait. The earliest suit made for a man of perhaps 32 inches at the waist. The latest for a man of over 50 inches. The transformation of a body and perhaps a soul. Weapons from across centuries fill the display cases. Swords and halberds and maces and crossbows. Pole arms and daggers and shields and helmets. The technology of violence, preserved behind glass. Each weapon was designed to kill. Each was used to kill. The metal that shines so beautifully under the museum lights once dripped with blood. The line of kings display, wooden horses carrying royal armor, dates back to 1688. It is the world's oldest museum exhibit, a tourist attraction that predates the word tourist by more than a century. Visitors have been coming to marvel at these displays for over 3 centuries, making the tower one of England's first heritage sites. But the tower's architecture reveals something beyond these displays, something hidden. The thickness of those 15-foot walls creates space. Hidden within the stone are passages and chambers that most visitors never see. Small rooms tucked into corners where guards could rest or servants could sleep. Spiral staircases threading through walls so thick that sound barely penetrates. The builders created a fortress within a fortress, secret spaces invisible from outside. One passage runs through the eastern wall, connecting chambers that could serve as private quarters for important guests, or, when needed, as cells for important prisoners. The distinction was often merely semantic. A comfortable cell was still a cell. A guest who could not leave was still a prisoner. Another staircase, barely wide enough for one person, descends to a basement level below the main ground floor. This was used as a dungeon in the tower's darker centuries. The darkness here is absolute. No windows, no natural light. The stone sweats with moisture seeping from the Thames. Prisoners held here lived in perpetual night, losing track of time, losing track of hope. The White Tower was designed to serve multiple purposes simultaneously. A royal residence that could house the king in luxury, a fortress that could withstand any siege, a treasury that could protect the kingdom's wealth, an armory that could equip an army, a chapel that could save souls, and yes, a prison that could hold anyone who threatened the crown. This multiplicity of function would define the tower for centuries to come. It was never just one thing. It was whatever the monarch needed it to be. The White Tower was just the beginning. Over the next 200 years, successive kings transformed the single keep into an elaborate fortress complex covering 18 acres. Each monarch added walls, towers, gatehouses, apartments, chapels, gardens. By the end of the 13th century, the Tower of London had become the most formidable castle in England, perhaps in all of Europe. The expansion began almost immediately after the White Tower's completion. William Rufus, the son who finished his father's work, added a wall along the north side of the complex, extending the protected area beyond the original Norman perimeter. But Rufus was not a great builder. He was too busy fighting wars in Normandy and Scotland, too busy quarreling with the church, too busy with the hunting that would eventually kill him. In 1100, Rufus died in the New Forest, struck by an arrow during a hunt. Whether it was accident or assassination has never been determined. His brother Henry seized the throne and the tower with it. Henry's sherne strengthened the defenses but made no dramatic changes. Neither did Stephen, who spent most of his reign fighting a civil war against his cousin Matilda. The tower changed hands multiple times during this conflict, demonstrating both its strategic importance and the limitations of any fortress when political chaos reigns. Richard the Lionheart, that crusading king who barely spent 6 months in England during his entire 10-year reign, ordered the first major defensive improvements. Richard understood siege warfare better than any English king before him. He had studied fortifications across Europe and the Holy Land. He had built Chateau Gaillard in Normandy, one of the most advanced castles of its age. He knew the White Tower, for all its strength, had weaknesses. A single keep, no matter how massive, could be surrounded, starved out, undermined. Attackers could dig tunnels beneath the walls, shore them up with wooden props, then set fire to the props. When the wood burned, the tunnel would collapse, and the wall above would crumble. Modern defensive theory called for multiple layers of protection. Richard ordered a ditch dug around the White Tower, separating it from the surrounding city. This ditch would later be filled with water from the Thames to create a moat. A curtain wall began to rise around the keep, studded with smaller towers at regular intervals. Defenders on these towers could rake attackers with crossfire, making any assault on the main wall extraordinarily costly. But Richard spent his money fighting in the Crusades, and the work progressed slowly. He died in 1199 from a crossbow bolt during a minor siege in France, killed by a boy defending a castle Richard was besieging over a minor slight. His brother John continued the construction, but John had other problems. His reign was one long crisis, culminating in the Magna Carta Rebellion. The greatest builder of the medieval tower was Henry III. Henry ruled from 1216 to 1272, one of the longest reigns in English history. He came to the throne as a child of 9, inheriting a kingdom racked by civil war and foreign invasion. He spent the next half-century rebuilding, stabilizing, and beautifying his realm. He was not a warrior king like Richard. He preferred art to battle, architecture to conquest, diplomacy to war. His tastes were refined, even extravagant. He loved beautiful things, beautiful buildings, beautiful ceremonies, and he poured money into the tower. Under Henry's direction, the inner curtain wall rose to its full height around the White Tower. The wall was studded with 9 new towers, each one a small fortress in itself. These towers had names that would echo through centuries of English history: the Salt Tower, the Broad Arrow Tower, the Constable Tower, the Martin Tower, the Bowyer Tower, the Flint Tower, the Devereux Tower, the Beauchamp Tower, the Bell Tower. Each tower served multiple purposes: living quarters for garrison soldiers and their families, storage for weapons, provisions, and valuables, defensive positions that could be held even if the curtain wall was breached, and, eventually, prison cells for the important and the dangerous. Henry also transformed the tower from a fortress into a palace, perhaps the most comfortable royal residence in England. He built a great hall along the south wall, facing the river, where he could hold feasts and receive ambassadors in appropriate splendor. The hall was massive, perhaps 80 feet long and 40 feet wide, with a high timber roof and large windows overlooking the Thames. At one end, a raised dais held the royal table. Along the walls, tapestries and painted cloths kept out drafts and displayed the king's wealth. He created private apartments for himself and his queen, Eleanor of Provence, bedchambers with painted walls and tiled floors, dressing rooms, private chapels, chambers for the royal children, who were born and raised within these walls. He ordered the walls painted with biblical scenes and heraldic devices: the Virgin and Child, the story of the Maccabees, the royal arms of England. The columns were gilded. The floors were tiled in intricate geometric patterns of green and gold. Expensive textiles hung from the walls. Henry even added gardens where the queen could walk and the royal children could play. Grass and flowers within fortress walls. Beauty within brutality. The contrast was intentional. The tower was meant to demonstrate that the king could command both war and peace, both strength and grace. For a few decades, the tower was genuinely palatial. The royal family spent extended periods here. The children were educated within the walls. The queen maintained a household of dozens of ladies and servants. The tower was not just a fortress, it was home. But Henry's son, Edward I, had different priorities. Edward was everything his father was not: a warrior, a conqueror, the hammer of the Scots, and the scourge of the Welsh. He conquered Wales completely, building a ring of massive castles to hold it down. He spent years trying to subdue Scotland, winning battles, but never quite winning the war. He understood military architecture in ways his father never had. Edward looked at his father's beautiful palace and saw weakness. The inner curtain wall was strong, but it had no depth. An attacker who breached it would be inside the fortress immediately. There was no second line of defense, no fallback position, no killing ground. So Edward built one. He added a second curtain wall beyond Henry's, creating the concentric defense system that still exists today. He drained Henry's moat, dug a new and much larger one, and built the outer wall along its inner edge. The new moat was 160 feet wide in places, fed by the Thames, its waters deep enough to prevent undermining and too wide for siege towers to bridge. This arrangement meant that attackers would face an almost impossible task. First, they would have to cross the moat under fire from the outer wall. Then, they would have to breach the outer wall, while defenders on the inner wall shot down at them. Then, they would have to cross the narrow killing ground between the walls, exposed to fire from both sides. Then, they would have to breach the inner wall, with the White Tower looming behind it. No army in medieval Europe could have accomplished this. The tower had become impregnable. The main entrance became an elaborate trap, a gauntlet of death for any attacker foolish enough to try. Visitors today enter through the middle tower, a gatehouse on the outer edge of the moat. Then they cross a stone causeway over the water to the Byward Tower, the main gatehouse in the outer wall. In medieval times, this causeway was made of wood and could be destroyed in a siege, leaving the Byward Tower isolated, surrounded by water, impossible to approach. The Byward Tower itself bristles with defensive features that would have made any attacker's heart sink. Murder holes in the ceiling allowed defenders to pour boiling water, heated sand, or burning pitch onto attackers below. Arrow loops in the walls provided firing positions while protecting the archers within. Multiple doors and portcullises could be dropped in sequence, trapping attackers in a killing zone with no escape. Beyond the Byward Tower lies another open space, another killing ground, overlooked by towers on every side. Attackers who made it this far would face a storm of arrows and crossbow bolts from every direction. Then, the Bell Tower, controlling access to the inner ward. Each step of the approach was a potential death trap. But the most notorious entrance came from the river. St. Thomas's Tower was built by Edward I over a water gate that allowed boats to enter the fortress directly from the Thames. The arched entrance led to a dock within the walls, a convenient and private way to deliver supplies, receive important visitors, or bring in prisoners without the public spectacle of the main gate. It became known as Traitors Gate. For centuries, prisoners accused of treason were brought to the tower by boat, entering through this dark, dripping archway. The journey itself was designed to terrify. A boat from Westminster or from the prisons of London rowed by silent oarsmen through the murky waters, the massive arch approaching, growing larger and darker with each stroke of the oars, the sound of water echoing against stone, the clang of gates closing behind. Anne Boleyn passed through Traitors Gate on May 2nd, 1536, knowing she would likely never leave. According to witnesses, She fell to her knees on the landing, crying out, "O Lord, help me, as I am guiltless of that whereof I am accused." The guards helped her to her feet and led her to her lodgings. Elizabeth, before she became queen, was brought through this same gate in 1554, accused of plotting against her sister Mary. She reportedly refused to enter, sitting down on the wet stones in protest, declaring, "Here lands as true a subject, being prisoner, as ever landed at these stairs." She sat in the rain until her attendants convinced her to move inside. Thomas More, who had served Henry VIII as Lord Chancellor before refusing to acknowledge his break with Rome, entered through this gate knowing he would never leave. He was executed on Tower Hill 16 months later. The gate still exists. The water still laps against the stone. The iron bars are rusted but intact. Visitors can stand where prisoners once stood, looking up at the walls that would hold them, feeling the damp air and the crushing weight of stone above. Some things the centuries cannot change. The tower was never just a prison. For centuries, it was a living, breathing community. At its peak, several hundred people lived within its walls: soldiers and their families, servants and craftsmen, administrators and clergy, animals of every description. The tower had its own chapel, its own tavern, its own shops and markets. It operated as a self-contained village with its own laws and customs that existed somewhat independently of the city outside. The man at the top of this community was the constable of the tower. This was one of the most powerful and prestigious positions in England. The constable controlled the fortress, commanded its garrison, and held responsibility for its prisoners. He answered directly to the monarch. His word was law within the walls. He could arrest, imprison, and even execute on royal authority. The job came with considerable perks: a residence inside the tower in what became known as the Queen's House, a comfortable dwelling overlooking Tower Green, substantial income from fees and privileges associated with the position, the right to claim any cattle that fell off London Bridge into the moat, the right to all swans on the Thames for a certain distance, the right to a portion of any cargo from ships that ran aground nearby. These may sound quaint today, but in medieval England they represented real wealth. The constableship was typically awarded to powerful nobles as a mark of royal favor and trust. Many served for decades, passing the position down through their families. They lived in considerable style, maintaining their own households within the fortress, entertaining visitors, conducting the daily business of running what was essentially a small town. Beneath the constable served the lieutenant of the tower, who handled day-to-day operations, and the various officers responsible for specific functions: the master of the ordnance, who oversaw the weapons; the keeper of the records, who maintained the national archives stored here; the keeper of the jewels, who guarded the regalia. Each had their own staff, their own quarters, their own small domain within the larger fortress. And beneath all of them served the yeoman warders. Henry VII established this force in 1485, shortly after winning the Battle of Bosworth and claiming the throne. The yeomen of the guard were his personal bodyguards, the oldest military corps in existence. The yeoman warders were their counterparts at the tower, responsible for protecting the fortress, and most importantly, guarding its prisoners. They wore distinctive uniforms, the same red and gold tunics still worn today by the men who give tours and pose for photographs. The design has changed little in 5 centuries. The nickname Beefeater probably comes from their right to eat beef from the king's table, a significant privilege in an age when meat was expensive and ordinary people rarely tasted it. The yeoman warders lived inside the tower with their families. Children were born within the walls. They learned to walk in the same courtyards where prisoners took their exercise. They played hide and seek in towers where men had been tortured. They attended services in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the small church inside the inner ward. This same chapel served as the burial ground for executed prisoners. The bodies were interred beneath the floor, often in unmarked locations. Anne Boleyn lies there. Catherine Howard lies there. Lady Jane Grey lies there. The children of the yeoman warders worshipped above the bones of queens. This proximity created strange intimacies between jailers and prisoners. High-ranking prisoners often lived in surprising comfort, at least those who could afford it. They occupied rooms in the various towers, furnished with their own belongings brought from home, attended by their own servants who were permitted to stay with them. They could receive visitors on specified days. They could write letters, though these were usually read by officials. They could maintain correspondence with friends and family outside. They could have meals sent in from taverns beyond the walls, avoiding the institutional food provided by the tower's kitchens. Some kept pets for companionship. Some conducted business, managing their estates and affairs through messengers. Some wrote books, producing some of the great works of English literature from within these walls. Sir Walter Raleigh, the explorer and courtier, was imprisoned in the Tower twice. His second imprisonment lasted 13 years, from 1603 to 1616. He occupied rooms in the Bloody Tower, quite comfortable by prison standards, with a view of the river. He grew tobacco in the small garden attached to his quarters, experimenting with cultivation techniques he had learned in Virginia. He conducted scientific experiments, distilling medicines and studying chemistry, converting a hen house into a makeshift laboratory. He wrote his massive History of the World, over 1 million words tracing human civilization from creation to the fall of Rome, one of the most ambitious scholarly projects of the age. His wife and eldest son were permitted to live with him much of the time. His wife gave birth to a second son, Carew, within the Tower walls. Raleigh entertained visitors, maintained his reputation as a wit and intellectual, and lived as something approaching a gentleman. But he could not leave. He could not walk free. He remained, for all his comforts, a prisoner. Eventually, in 1616, he was released to lead an expedition to South America in search of gold. When the expedition failed and Raleigh violated his orders by attacking a Spanish settlement, he was returned to the Tower. This time, he was executed. His last words, running his finger along the axe blade, were reportedly, "This is sharp medicine, but it is a physician for all diseases." Not all prisoners enjoyed such comfort. Those who could not pay for their keep, or whose families could not or would not pay, found themselves in far worse conditions. The fees for imprisonment were substantial. A gentleman might pay several pounds per week for a comfortable room, servants, decent food, heating, candles, and other amenities. A poor prisoner might be confined to a basement cell, fed bread and water, left in darkness without heat or sanitation. The lowest cells, the dungeons beneath the towers, were places of genuine horror. No light reached these depths. No heat penetrated the stone. The only sanitation was a bucket that might be emptied once a week. Rats scurried in the darkness. Water seeped through the walls. Prisoners breathed air so foul it made them sick. Some prisoners languished in these conditions for years. Others died of disease, of cold, of simple neglect. The distinction between prisoner and torture victim could be minimal. You didn't need the rack to break someone. You just needed time and darkness and the knowledge that no one was coming to help. The Tower also housed some unexpected residents. Beginning in the 13th century, the kings of England kept a royal menagerie at the Tower. The collection started when the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II sent Henry III 3 leopards as a wedding gift, a heraldic pun on the 3 leopards in the English royal arms. Henry was delighted. He built a special house for them near the main entrance. Then the King of Norway sent a polar bear. Henry had it fitted with a long chain and allowed it to fish in the Thames, partly because polar bears eat a great deal and fish were cheaper than meat. Contemporary accounts describe crowds gathering to watch the great white bear plunge into the murky river and emerge with fish in its jaws. Then the King of France sent an elephant. It was the first elephant in England since the Roman era. Crowds came from miles around to see it, but the animal did not thrive. Unable to adapt to the English climate or diet, it died within a few years. Its skeleton was preserved for a time, a curiosity for visitors to marvel at. Over the centuries, the menagerie grew. Lions were added, becoming the centerpiece of the collection. They were kept in a building near the main entrance called the Lion Tower, their roars audible throughout the fortress. Tigers, leopards, hyenas, baboons and monkeys, exotic birds, a grizzly bear, a kangaroo, a zebra, an ostrich, which reportedly ate a nail and died. The menagerie was one of London's first tourist attractions. Visitors could pay to see the animals, making the experience available to anyone with a few coins. For centuries, the roaring of lions and the screaming of monkeys provided a strange soundtrack to the tower's more serious business. The menagerie lasted until 1835, when the animals were finally moved to the new London Zoo in Regent's Park. 6 centuries of exotic animals had lived and died within the tower walls, but one group of birds remained: the ravens. Legend says that if the ravens ever leave the tower, the kingdom will fall. Charles II supposedly ordered that at least 6 ravens must always be kept at the tower, their wings clipped to prevent escape. The monarchy, the tower, and the ravens are bound together by prophecy and tradition. Whether this story is true or a Victorian invention is still debated by historians. What's certain is that the ravens remain. 7 of them today, 1 extra as insurance, cared for by a yeoman warder with the official title of Raven Master. They wander the grounds freely, occasionally stealing food from tourists, occasionally attacking small dogs, occasionally croaking at visitors with what sounds disconcertingly like human speech. They have names: Jubilee, Harris, Grip, Rocky, Aaron, Poppy, Georgie. They have distinct personalities. They recognize individual people, and they have outlived countless prisoners who passed through the same gates. The tower's reputation for horror was not unearned. Torture was used here, not constantly, not casually, but when the crown deemed it necessary. English common law technically prohibited torture, setting England apart from most of Europe. But the monarch could authorize it through royal warrant, bypassing the common law courts entirely. The tower was where those warrants were executed. Between 1540 and 1640, at least 48 torture warrants were issued. The true number may be higher. Records are incomplete, and not every application of pain left a paper trail. The torture chamber occupied the basement of the White Tower, a room of perpetual darkness lit only by torches and candles. The stone walls are still blackened by centuries of smoke. The floor is still worn smooth by countless feet. The air is still damp and cold, even in summer. The most famous instrument was the rack. This device consisted of a large rectangular wooden frame raised slightly off the floor on legs. At each end, rollers were fitted with handles that could be turned by the torturers. The prisoner was laid on the frame, face up, wrists secured with ropes attached to the roller at one end, ankles secured to the roller at the other. As the handles were turned, the rollers rotated and the ropes tightened. Slowly, inch by inch, the body was stretched. First the muscles strained, then the joints separated, then the tendons tore. The pain was beyond description. Prisoners screamed until they lost their voices. They confessed to crimes they had not committed, named conspirators they had never met, revealed secrets they had never known. The rack could extract any confession. Whether that confession had any relationship to truth was another matter entirely. A man in enough pain will say anything to make it stop. Prisoners were sometimes permanently crippled even if they survived the session. Shoulders remained dislocated for life. Hips never healed properly. Some could never walk again, some could never feed themselves. Their muscles and tendons, once torn, never regained full function. The rack was used most heavily during the Tudor period, when religious conflict created endless suspects to interrogate. Catholics under Henry VIII and Edward VI, Protestants under Mary, Catholics again under Elizabeth. The wheel of persecution turned, and the rack was always waiting. Guy Fawkes was stretched on the rack in November 1605 after his failed attempt to blow up Parliament with 36 barrels of gunpowder hidden in the cellars beneath the House of Lords. He had been defiant when captured, proud of his cause, willing to die for his faith and his mission. A desperate disease, he reportedly told his captors, requires a dangerous remedy. The rack changed him. His signature on his first confession, given before torture, is bold and confident, the handwriting of a man still in control of himself. His signature on his final confession is barely legible, the letters shaky and uncertain, the hand that held the pen trembling uncontrollably. The documents survive side by side, a testament to what the Tower could do to a man. But the rack was not the only method available. The manacles were simple but effective. Iron cuffs attached to chains hanging from a beam above. The prisoners' wrists were locked into the cuffs, and then their feet were lifted from the floor, leaving them suspended entirely by their wrists. At first, this was merely uncomfortable, but as minutes stretched into hours, the discomfort became agony. The weight of the body pulled on the shoulder joints. Arms went numb, then screamed with pain as circulation was cut off. Breathing became difficult as the chest was forced into an unnatural position. The heart labored, the lungs struggled. Some prisoners were left hanging for hours, some for days. The Scavenger's Daughter, invented in the Tower itself by a lieutenant named Skeffington, was the opposite of the rack. Rather than stretching the body, it compressed it. The device was an iron frame shaped roughly like the letter A. The prisoner was forced into a crouching position, head between knees, and locked into the frame. Then screws tightened the frame, compressing the body further and further. Ribs cracked. Internal organs were crushed. Blood ran from the nose and ears and mouth. Men confessed to anything just to be released. But perhaps the most insidious torture required no equipment at all. The Little Ease was a cell in the basement of the White Tower measuring roughly 4 feet in each direction. A box of stone. The name was grimly accurate. A prisoner in this space could neither stand up straight, nor lie down fully extended, nor sit comfortably with legs extended. They were forced to crouch perpetually in the darkness. The first hour was merely uncomfortable. The first day was painful. After several days, the muscles screamed constantly. Cramps seized the legs and back. Sleep was impossible in any position. The body began to break down. The mind followed. Prisoners could spend weeks in the Little Ease. Some emerged unable to walk, their leg muscles atrophied, their joints frozen in the crouch. Some emerged mad. Some did not emerge at all. The psychological torture was equally devastating, perhaps more so. Prisoners could hear the screams of others being tortured. Sound carried through the stone corridors, echoing and distorted but unmistakable. They could hear the questions, the demands, the confessions. They could imagine what awaited them. They could see from their windows the construction of scaffolds on Tower Green or Tower Hill. They could watch the carpenters building the platform, testing the trapdoor, setting up the block. They could count the days until their own appointment with the executioner. They knew that confession might bring death. But refusal to confess might bring something worse. The choice was not between life and death. It was between a quick end and slow agony. Between the axe and the rack. Many prisoners left their marks on the walls, desperate attempts to say, "I was here, I existed, remember me?" Throughout the tower, stone is carved with the inscriptions of the doomed. Names, dates, prayers, coats of arms, declarations of innocence, messages to loved ones who might never see them, prayers to God, curses against enemies. The Beauchamp Tower contains the most elaborate carvings. Here, the Dudley family left their mark during the reign of Queen Mary. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, had tried to put Lady Jane Grey on the throne instead of Mary. He and his sons were imprisoned for treason. While awaiting their fate, the Dudley brothers carved their family crest into the soft stone of their cell. A bare and ragged staff, the Dudley emblem, their names, Latin mottos. The work is intricate, clearly the product of tools and time. These were not desperate scratchings, but careful, deliberate memorials. Men facing death, choosing to leave beauty behind. The Salt Tower contains the astronomical clock carved by Hugh Draper, imprisoned in 1561 on charges of sorcery. The carving shows the celestial sphere, the zodiac signs, the movements of the heavens. Draper was a learned man, and even in captivity, he turned to the stars. Perhaps they offered comfort. Perhaps they offered perspective. Perhaps they simply passed the time. Other inscriptions are simpler, just a name and a date, just a prayer. Be faithful unto death. He that endureth to the end shall be saved. The most unhappy man in the world is he that is not patient in adversity. The words of men and women facing eternity, trying to leave some mark on the world that would outlast their bodies. These inscriptions survive. The prisoners who made them do not. The tower earned its bloodiest reputation during the Tudor dynasty. Henry VIII sent 2 of his 6 wives to execution here. Anne Boleyn in 1536 accused of adultery, incest, and treason. Catherine Howard in 1542 accused of the same crimes. Both died on Tower Green, beheaded in the small courtyard, rather than the public stage of Tower Hill. Why the private execution? Possibly mercy, sparing them the mob's gaze. Possibly shame, hiding the spectacle of a queen's death. Possibly fear that the public might sympathize with a fallen queen and turn against the king who killed her. Thomas More, who had served Henry as Lord Chancellor before refusing to acknowledge his supremacy over the church, spent 15 months in the Bell Tower before his execution. He wrote during his imprisonment, composing prayers and meditations on the approach of death. His final work, De Tristitia Christi, on the agony of Christ in Gethsemane, was left unfinished, interrupted by his own walk to the scaffold. He walked to his execution on Tower Hill on July 6, 1535, reportedly joking with his guards, asking for help climbing the rickety scaffold, and promising to shift for himself coming down. He forgave his executioner and moved his beard aside, saying it had committed no treason and should not suffer. Henry's daughter Mary, attempting to restore Catholicism to England, filled the tower's cells with Protestant leaders. Bishops and priests, reformers and radicals, all passed through these gates. Many emerged only for their executions. The burnings at Smithfield gave her the name Bloody Mary, but the tower played its part. His other daughter Elizabeth, before she became queen, was herself imprisoned here. Mary suspected her of plotting rebellion, of conspiring with Protestant rebels to seize the throne. Elizabeth spent 2 terrifying months in the Bell Tower, not knowing if each day would be her last. She survived, she became queen, but she never forgot. The tower had held her, and the tower would hold others in her name. The most haunting mystery of all centers on the Bloody Tower. In 1483, the young King Edward V, just 12 years old, and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, aged 9, were lodged in the Tower by their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Their father, Edward IV, had just died unexpectedly. The boys' uncle was supposed to protect them, serving as Lord Protector until young Edward came of age. Instead, Richard declared the boys illegitimate, barred from the throne by their father's allegedly secret prior marriage to another woman. Parliament agreed, or was made to agree. Richard crowned himself King Richard III. The princes were seen playing in the Tower Gardens for a time. Then they were seen no more. For over 500 years, their fate has been debated. Most historians believe they were murdered, almost certainly on Richard's orders. Dead princes could not be rescued by their supporters. Dead princes could not press their claims. Dead princes could not grow up to lead rebellions. Richard had motive, opportunity, and the ruthlessness to do it, but no bodies were ever found. No confession was ever made. The boys simply vanished, as if the tower had swallowed them whole. Then, in 1674, workmen demolishing a staircase near the White Tower discovered a wooden chest buried 10 feet underground. Inside were the bones of 2 children. The discovery caused a sensation. These must be the princes. Who else could they be? Charles II ordered the bones reburied in Westminster Abbey, in a marble urn designed by Christopher Wren. They rest there still in the Henry VII Chapel, with an inscription declaring them to be the sons of Edward IV. The bones were examined once in 1933 by a team of doctors and anatomists. Their conclusions were frustratingly vague. The bones were consistent with boys of approximately the right age. But the science of the time could not determine sex with certainty, could not establish cause of death, could not confirm identity. Modern DNA testing could almost certainly answer these questions. Comparisons with known descendants, with bones from the York family tomb at Fotheringhay, could establish whether these are truly the princes. But requests to conduct such testing have been consistently refused. The bones are in the care of the Abbey, and the Abbey guards its dead. The mystery of the princes in the tower endures. The tower where they were last seen is still called the Bloody Tower. The bones rest in Westminster Abbey. The truth remains buried with them. Death was not the tower's only business. Since the 14th century, the tower has served as the home of the crown jewels, the dazzling collection of crowns, scepters, orbs, swords, and ceremonial objects used in the coronation of English and later British monarchs. Today, they are the tower's greatest attraction, drawing visitors from around the world to file past display cases and marvel at treasures beyond price. But the collection you see today is not the medieval original. The current crown jewels date only to 1661, created from scratch after the most systematic act of cultural destruction in English history. During the English Civil War, Parliament decided that the old royal regalia represented tyranny. The crowns that had touched the heads of kings for centuries were symbols of oppression. They had to be destroyed. In 1649, after the execution of Charles III, Parliament ordered the crown jewels broken up and melted down. The gold was sold, the gems were pried from their settings and disposed of separately. Ancient crowns, some dating back to Edward the Confessor, were reduced to bullion. St. Edward's crown, used at coronations for centuries, was destroyed. Alfred the Great's crown, if it still existed, was destroyed. Centuries of craftsmanship vanished into the melting pot. The sale raised about £2,000. The historical loss was incalculable. When Charles II returned from exile to claim his throne in 1660, there was nothing left. No crown to place on his head, no scepter to hold, no orb to represent his dominion. everything had to be remade from scratch for his coronation in 1661. The new regalia were magnificent. Some of the old gems were tracked down and repurchased from the dealers who had bought them. New stones were added from royal collections and foreign gifts. The finest goldsmiths in London labored over the designs, creating pieces that balanced tradition with innovation. A new St. Edward's crown was made for the coronation itself, following descriptions of the medieval original. New scepters, new orbs, new swords, new rings, a complete set of regalia for a restored monarchy. The crowns and scepters made for Charles II's still form the core of today's collection, but they have been added to over the centuries, and some of the additions are spectacular beyond imagining. The imperial state crown is the centerpiece of the display. It was made in 1937 for the coronation of George VI, replacing an earlier crown that had become too fragile for use, but it incorporates treasures of immense antiquity. The crown contains 2,768 diamonds arranged in elaborate patterns, 17 sapphires, 11 emeralds, 269 pearls, and 4 rubies, including the most famous gemstone in Britain. The Black Prince's ruby sits front and center on the crown's front cross. It is actually not a ruby at all, but a spinel, a different mineral that was not distinguished from true ruby until modern times. But this technicality takes nothing from its history. The stone weighs roughly 170 carats, the size of a chicken's egg. It was given to Edward, Prince of Wales, known as the Black Prince, by Pedro the Cruel of Castile in 1367 as payment for English military assistance. Henry V wore this gem on his helmet at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. Legend says a French sword blow dented the helmet and nearly killed the king, but the strike missed the ruby by inches. True or not, the story has attached itself to the stone for 6 centuries. When you look at the imperial state crown, you look at a gem that was present at one of England's greatest victories. Behind the Black Prince's ruby sits the Stuart sapphire, a 104-carat blue gem that belonged to the Stuart kings. Charles II smuggled it out of England when he fled into exile during the Civil War, keeping it hidden for years on the continent. He brought it back when he reclaimed the throne. The sapphire represents survival, continuity, the persistence of the crown through disaster. At the very top of the crown, set in the cross above all other jewels, is the second star of Africa, the Cullinan II diamond at 317 carats. This diamond, and its larger sibling, have a remarkable story. In 1905, workers in the premier mine in South Africa discovered the largest gem-quality diamond ever found. The Cullinan diamond weighed 3,106 carats in the rough, roughly 1.4 pounds of crystallized carbon. It was so large that the mine's owner initially thought it must be a fake, a piece of glass planted as a joke. The Transvaal colonial government purchased the diamond and presented it to King Edward VII as a 66th birthday gift. The gesture was partly genuine respect, partly political calculation. South Africa wanted to remain in the good graces of the British Crown. The diamond was sent to Amsterdam to be cut by the Asher brothers, the world's leading diamond cutters. Joseph Asher reportedly studied the stone for months before making the first cut. When he finally struck the blade, the stone split perfectly. Then he fainted from the tension. The diamond was cut into 9 major stones and nearly 100 smaller ones. The 2 largest were named the Great Star of Africa and the Second Star of Africa, and both were mounted in the crown jewels. The Great Star of Africa, or Cullinan Mon, weighs 530 carats. It is the largest clear-cut diamond in the world. It sits in the sovereign's scepter, the golden rod that symbolizes the monarch's temporal authority. When the scepter is held during coronation, the largest cut diamond ever created glitters at its head. The sovereign's orb sits beside the scepter in the display. This golden globe, surmounted by a cross, symbolizes the monarch's role as defender of the faith and supreme governor of the Church of England. The world beneath the cross represents the Christian realm. The orb is hollow, which is fortunate. A solid gold orb of that size would weigh far too much to lift. Saint Edward's crown remains the most sacred piece in the collection. It is used only once, at the moment of coronation itself, when the Archbishop of Canterbury places it on the new monarch's head. Made of solid gold, set with amethysts, topazes, and other semi-precious stones, the crown weighs nearly 5 pounds. Charles III wore this crown on May 6, 2023, just as his mother had worn it 70 years before, just as his grandfather and great-grandfather and all the monarchs back to Charles II's restoration had worn versions of it. The crown connects present to past, a golden thread running through English history. The security surrounding these treasures is extraordinary. The jewel house, where the crown jewels are displayed, is a vault within a fortress. The walls are reinforced concrete. The display cases are bomb-proof glass. The doors weigh several tons each. The security systems are classified, but are believed to include motion sensors, pressure sensors, heat sensors, video surveillance, and instant lockdown capabilities. Armed guards patrol constantly. The response time to any intrusion is measured in seconds. This level of security was not always present. In 1671, an Irish adventurer named Thomas Blood attempted what should have been impossible. He tried to steal the crown jewels. Blood was a veteran of the Civil War, a former soldier turned criminal and intelligence agent. He had already attempted to kidnap the Duke of Ormond, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, a botched operation that left Blood a wanted man. He was audacious, charming, and utterly without scruple. For weeks, Blood cultivated the elderly keeper of the jewels, a man named Talbot Edwards. Blood disguised himself as a parson, a respectable figure in Restoration England. He visited the tower with a female companion he claimed was his wife and struck up a friendship with Edwards. He suggested a marriage between Edward's daughter and his own nephew, a respectable connection for a humble keeper. On the morning of May 9, 1671, Blood arrived with 3 companions, ostensibly to finalize the marriage arrangements. Edwards, delighted at his daughter's prospects, led them to the jewel house, where the regalia were kept behind a metal grill. As soon as they were inside, Blood and his accomplices attacked. They beat Edwards with a mallet, stabbed him, and gagged him with a wooden plug. Edwards lost consciousness. Then they set about the theft. Blood hid the state crown beneath his cloak, after flattening it with the mallet to make it fit. One accomplice stuffed the orb down his trousers. Another attempted to file the scepter in half so it could be concealed. They might have escaped. But at that moment, Edward's son arrived unexpectedly. He had been abroad with the army and came home without warning. Finding his father bloodied and unconscious, he raised the alarm. Blood and his accomplices fled across the tower grounds, with the crown jewels bouncing beneath their clothes. They were caught on the wharf, trying to reach horses they had left outside the gates. Blood reportedly fired a pistol during the pursuit. Blood was brought before Charles II for questioning. What happened next remains one of history's mysteries. Instead of executing Blood, as everyone expected and the law demanded, Charles pardoned him. He restored Blood's confiscated Irish estates. He granted him a pension of £500 per year. Why? Theories abound. Some historians believe Blood was actually a government agent, that the theft was part of some elaborate intelligence operation that went wrong. Some believe Charles admired Blood's sheer audacity, one rogue recognizing another. Some believe Blood knew damaging secrets about the king, perhaps about Charles' secret treaty with Catholic France, and blackmailed his way to freedom. The truth has never been established. Blood lived freely until his death in 1680, his secrets buried with him. The crown jewels were returned to the tower, somewhat dented but otherwise undamaged. No one has successfully stolen them since. The tower's military function never truly ended, long after it ceased to be a regular royal residence. Long after the medieval courts moved to more comfortable palaces, the fortress remained central to England's defense. It served as the nation's primary armory, manufacturing and storing weapons for the realm's armies for centuries. It served as a prison for enemies of the state well into modern times. It served, in the 20th century, as a holding place for spies and a backdrop for firing squads. The Board of Ordnance was headquartered at the tower from the 15th century until 1855. This government body was responsible for military supplies of all kinds: cannon and muskets, gunpowder and shot, uniforms and equipment. Everything the army needed to function flowed through the tower's offices. At its peak, the tower could store weapons for 30,000 soldiers. Vast warehouses within the walls held racks of muskets, piles of swords, barrels of gunpowder. Cannon were cast in foundries within the complex. Gunsmiths maintained and repaired weapons. The clang of hammer on anvil echoed through courtyards that had once heard coronation trumpets. The tower was also the royal mint for centuries. From the 13th century until 1810, England's coins were struck here. Master minters included Isaac Newton himself, who spent the last 3 decades of his life pursuing counterfeiters with the same intensity he had once applied to physics. The armory function continued well into the 19th century. During the Napoleonic Wars, the tower was a vital link in Britain's defense industry. Weapons flowed out to the armies fighting Napoleon across Europe. Captured French eagles and standards flowed back in, trophies of victory. But the tower's last prisoners were not Napoleonic marshals. They were German spies. During World War I, 11 German agents were captured and executed at the tower. They had been caught in Britain, attempting to gather intelligence on military movements, shipping, and troop dispositions. They were tried by military tribunal, found guilty of espionage, and sentenced to death. The executions took place in the tower's outer ward, in the dry moat at the miniature rifle range, away from public view. The prisoners faced firing squads of 8 soldiers. Most met their deaths with composure. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves in the East London cemetery. The executions were not publicized at the time. The government wanted to deter German spies without creating martyrs or revealing counterintelligence methods. The tower reverted to its ancient role as a place where the state's enemies were quietly disposed of. World War II brought more dramatic episodes. In May 1941, Rudolf Hess, deputy Führer of Nazi Germany, undertook one of the strangest missions of the war. He flew solo across the North Sea in a Messerschmitt Bf 110, parachuted into Scotland, and demanded to see the Duke of Hamilton. He claimed to be on a peace mission, hoping to negotiate an end to the war between Britain and Germany before Hitler's planned invasion of the Soviet Union. Whether Hess was acting on his own initiative, whether he was mad, or whether he was part of some faction within the Nazi leadership has never been conclusively established. Hitler declared him insane. The British didn't know what to make of him. But for 4 days, he was held as a prisoner in the Tower of London, the last state prisoner in the fortress's long history. Hess was kept in the lieutenant's house, the same building where high-ranking prisoners had been held for centuries. Guards watched him constantly, afraid he might attempt suicide. He was eventually moved to more secure facilities, then to Nuremberg for trial after the war, then to Spandau prison in Berlin, where he served a life sentence. He died in 1987, still a prisoner, the last of the major Nazis. But one more execution would take place within the tower walls. On August 15, 1941, Joseph Jacobs became the last person to be executed at the Tower of London. Jacobs was a German spy, parachuted into England as part of the Abwehr's intelligence operations. He had broken his ankle badly on landing and was captured almost immediately by the Home Guard, found lying in a field, unable to walk. He was tried by court-martial at the Duke of York's headquarters in Chelsea and sentenced to death. Because of his broken ankle, he could not stand before the firing squad. He was strapped into a brown Windsor chair placed against a stake in the tower's miniature rifle range. A white target was pinned over his heart. 8 soldiers of the Scots Guards took aim. The command was given. Jacobs died instantly. He was buried in an unmarked grave in St. Mary's Roman Catholic Cemetery in Kensal Green. A small marker was eventually added, noting only his name and the dates of his life. The tower survived the Blitz, though not unscathed. German bombs struck the fortress on several occasions, damaging the North Bastion and parts of the outer walls. The main guard building, an 18th century structure near the main entrance, was destroyed. A yeoman warder was killed on duty, but the medieval structures, built to withstand siege weapons, proved remarkably resilient against 20th century explosives. The White Tower, Traitors Gate, the Beauchamp Tower, all the iconic buildings survived essentially intact. The tower had been bombed by the Luftwaffe and emerged largely unchanged. After the war, the fortress transitioned fully into its modern role as a museum and tourist attraction. The last military garrison departed in 1978. The Royal Armories, though they maintain their historical headquarters in the White Tower, moved their main collection to a new facility in Leeds in 1996. The Yeoman Warders remain. Though their role has transformed, they are still technically military personnel, still subject to military discipline, but their primary function now is as guides and guardians of history, conducting tours for visitors from around the world. 3 million visitors come to the tower each year. They queue for hours to see the crown jewels, inching forward on a slow-moving travelator past display cases filled with gold and diamonds. They photograph the yeoman warders in their elaborate Tudor uniforms. They watch the ravens strut across Tower Green, sleek black birds that seem to own the place. The tower is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized as one of the most important historical structures in Britain, perhaps in the world. Historic Royal Palaces, the charitable organization that manages the site along with Hampton Court, Kensington Palace, and other royal residences, employs hundreds of people to maintain the buildings, conduct research, and tell the tower story. The conservation challenges are constant. These buildings are nearly 1,000 years old. Stone weathers, mortar crumbles, lead roofs develop leaks, medieval timbers develop rot. The tower is never truly finished being maintained. There is always another project, another repair, another restoration. The White Tower was extensively restored in the 19th century, when much of its Norman stonework was replaced with fresh limestone. Purists complain that the restoration was too aggressive, that authentic medieval fabric was unnecessarily removed. Pragmatists note that without the work, the building might not have survived another century. Similar debates surround every conservation project. How much intervention is too much? When does restoration become reconstruction? Where is the line between preserving history and creating a theme park version of the past? The yeoman warders still live within the walls. There are currently 37 of them, all former senior non-commissioned officers from the British Armed Forces with at least 22 years of distinguished service. They and their families occupy residences scattered throughout the fortress, in the towers and gatehouses and buildings where guards have lived for centuries. Their lives are unusual, to say the least. They share their home with 3 million tourists. They conduct tours throughout the day, reciting the tower's dark history with a mix of drama and dark humor. They answer the same questions hundreds of times. How many executions? Where are the princes buried? Can I pet the ravens? They participate in ceremonies that have remained unchanged for centuries. Every night, without fail, the tower is locked up with the ceremony of the keys. This ritual has taken place at exactly the same time, with exactly the same words, for over 700 years. It is believed to be the oldest military ceremony still performed in the world. At precisely 9:53 p.m., the chief yeoman warder emerges from the byward tower, carrying a lantern and the queen's keys. He meets an escort of soldiers and proceeds to lock first the outer gates, then the inner gates. As he returns, a sentry challenges him. Halt! Who comes there? The keys! Whose keys? King Charles's keys. Pass, King Charles's keys. All's well. The chief yeoman warder carries the keys to the queen's house, where the duty officer takes them for safekeeping overnight. At precisely 10 p.m. a bugler sounds the last post. The ceremony is complete. The ritual was not interrupted even during the Blitz. On April 16, 1941, a German bomb fell in the middle of the ceremony, wounding several participants. The chief yeoman warder helped tend to the wounded. Then, when order was restored, he completed the ceremony. A letter of apology was sent to the king, explaining that the ceremony had been delayed by enemy action. The king reportedly replied that the important thing was that it had been completed. Modern technology has transformed some aspects of tower life. The ravens now have tracking devices clipped to their feathers, miniature GPS units that allow keepers to find them if they wander. The birds occasionally leave the tower grounds, hopping over walls or gliding on updrafts. The trackers ensure they can be retrieved before the kingdom falls. The crown jewels are protected by security systems that would have seemed like magic to Thomas Blood. Sensors monitor every movement, every change in temperature or humidity. The response to any intrusion would be overwhelming. Archaeologists use ground-penetrating radar to search for hidden chambers and forgotten graves. Excavations continue to reveal new discoveries. Roman artifacts from the period before the tower existed. Medieval refuse that tells us what people ate and wore. The bones of long-forgotten prisoners. The tower's history is literally buried beneath its present. But some things resist explanation. The tower is one of the most haunted locations in Britain. That's not just tourist board marketing. Guards and visitors have reported sightings for centuries, long before there were tourists to impress. Anne Boleyn is the most frequently reported ghost. She has been seen walking on Tower Green, near the site of her execution, sometimes carrying her severed head. She has been seen in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where she is buried beneath the altar. She has been seen leading a ghostly procession through the corridors. Guards have reported locking up the chapel at night and seeing a light burning inside. When they investigate, the light vanishes. When they lock the door again and turn away, it returns. The young princes, Edward V and Richard of York, have been glimpsed in the Bloody Tower, dressed in white nightgowns, holding hands, their faces pale and frightened. They appear and vanish in the space between blinks. A mysterious bear, perhaps a ghost from the old menagerie, has been seen near the Martin Tower. A guard in the 19th century reportedly tried to bayonet it, only to have his weapon pass through empty air. He died of shock shortly after. Lady Arbella Stewart, imprisoned under James I for marrying without royal permission, has been seen walking the walls, still waiting for the rescue that never came. The ghost of Sir Walter Raleigh has been spotted near the Bloody Tower, where he spent so many years as a prisoner. He seems to have no particular purpose, just walking, watching, perhaps still waiting for the pardon that finally came too late. The yeoman warders tell these stories with a certain practiced skepticism. They are guides, not ghost hunters. They present the legends and let visitors draw their own conclusions. But some of them have had experiences they cannot explain. Footsteps in empty corridors, following them as they make their rounds. Cold spots that appear without cause, pockets of frigid air in rooms that should be warm. The sense of being watched, of another presence sharing a room that appears empty. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the tower carries its history heavily. The stones have witnessed so much suffering, so much death, so many last breaths and final prayers. If emotional resonance could imprint itself on physical matter, this place would be saturated with it. The Tower of London has stood on the banks of the Thames for nearly 1,000 years. It has been a palace where kings slept in splendor before their coronations and a prison where queens spent their final nights. It has stored the wealth of empires and the weapons of armies. It has witnessed torture and triumph, treason and loyalty, murder and mercy. Kings have plotted here, queens have wept here, children have vanished here, saints have prayed here, madmen have raved here, and ordinary people, guards and servants and craftsmen, have lived their ordinary lives within these extraordinary walls. The white walls that William the Conqueror raised to intimidate Anglo-Saxon Londoners still stand, though now they draw tourists instead of terror. The cells where prisoners carved their names into stone are now museum exhibits, the suffering preserved behind glass and explanatory placards. We sanitize our history. We have to. We cannot truly imagine what it meant to be stretched on the rack, to feel our joints separate, to hear our own screams echoing off stone. We cannot truly feel what Anne Boleyn felt, walking those final steps across Tower Green. We can only stand where she stood and try to imagine, knowing that our imagination falls short. We turn execution sites into photo opportunities. We queue to see the very jewels that men died trying to steal. We buy souvenir ravens in the gift shop, but the tower resists easy sentimentality. Stand in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard and Lady Jane Grey are buried beneath the floor, and the weight of the past presses down. The stones above their bones are worn smooth by centuries of feet. The names are carved on plaques, but the bodies lie below, where they fell after the scaffold, buried without ceremony, their graves unmarked for centuries. Walk through Traitors Gate at dusk, when the last visitors have gone, and the shadows lengthen across Tower Green, and you can almost hear the oars of approaching boats, the splash of water against stone, the clang of iron gates closing, the footsteps of prisoners climbing the stairs. The stones remember what we choose to forget. Every age has built on what came before. Norman conquerors raised the White Tower, establishing dominance through architecture. Medieval kings added walls and towers and gatehouses, creating a fortress within a fortress. The Tudors made it a prison and an execution ground, soaking its stones with blood. The Victorians made it a monument, opening its doors to tourists and preserving its horrors for posterity. Each generation has left its mark. Each has interpreted the tower according to its own needs and values. The fortress has been whatever its masters needed it to be. What will future generations see when they look at these walls? Perhaps they will see what we see, a fortress that embodies the brutal mechanics of power, a place where crowns were won and lost, a reminder that the line between king and prisoner can be terrifyingly thin. Perhaps they will see the birthplace of modern England, where Norman conquerors and Saxon subjects merged into something new, where law and tradition and national identity were forged in blood and stone. Or perhaps they will see something we cannot yet imagine. History is not finished with the tower. There are still secrets to uncover, still mysteries to solve, still discoveries waiting to be made beneath the medieval foundations. The bones in Westminster Abbey may yet be tested. and we may finally learn the fate of the princes. Hidden chambers may yet be found, filled with who knows what treasures or horrors. The past is not fixed. It changes as we learn more, as we ask different questions, as we bring new eyes to ancient stones. The ravens still watch from the walls, their black eyes seeing everything and revealing nothing. The keys still turn each night, locking the tower against the darkness as they have for 700 years. The stones still hold their secrets, yielding them slowly, reluctantly, one generation at a time. The tower endures. It was here before there was a city called London, before there was a nation called England, before there were tourists and guidebooks and gift shops. It will be here after we are gone, after our names are forgotten, after our bones are dust. Some stones remember. Some walls have seen too much to ever forget. Some places are simply too heavy with history to ever be ordinary again. The Tower of London is one of those places. It stands where it has always stood, on the banks of the Thames, watching the river flow past, watching the centuries pass, watching us come and go as it has watched so many before, and remembering everything.